Hey guys, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. It's your host Thomas Tyree from On the Hot Podcast. Today, this could be the Combat Series episode number 25 for you guys today. Of course, this episode is going to be coming out on all four of our platforms: our Instagram account, our Facebook account, our YouTube account, and our Apple Podcast account. So let's go ahead and dive into the first segment of the Combat Series this week. I'll be sharing my fight summary on the fight that took place this past Saturday in the sport of boxing between Benavidez and Demetrius Andrade. So, in the sport of boxing, we really saw the last really meaningful pay-per-view or meaningful fight card for Showtime Boxing. It is an end of an era that we are now going to be going on as boxing fans in the boxing community moving forward without HBO boxing and Showtime boxing moving forward. It's going to get some time to get used to. But nonetheless, I think they put together a really good card to go with a bang to end the calendar year 2023 Showtime Boxing. So thank you, Al Heyman and company, for doing that. But Saturday night, we saw Benavidez went on to defeat Demetrius Andrade by technical knockout in the 7th round. A lot of people say 6th round. It could be 7th round. As far as I'm concerned, it was the 7th round because it was at least two seconds into the 7th round when the bell rang. And 2 seconds later, the fight was called off. So I'm calling it a technical knockout in the 7th round. But nonetheless, Benavidez went on to successfully retain his interim WBC super middleweight title against Demetrius Andrade in a technical knockout decision. And the decision with the fight ending, it played out on both sides. The camera footage showed that Demetrius Andrade said to the corner, "Call it." He didn't want to fight anymore, and the corner did the same thing as well. They called it, and that's what happened when the fight ended on the stool for Demetrius Andrade. But nonetheless, Benavidez moves on, and I predicted it on the Combat Series last week. Last Friday when I recorded Combat Series episode number 24, you guys go back and watch and listen to that episode of the Combat Series. But I also predicted that Benavidez would defeat Demetrius Andrade by knockout within the 6 to 9 rounds of the interim championship fight. And I just felt like the two caliber fighters meeting at the level that they are in their respective careers, that fight was not going to go to decision. And I said somebody was going to get knocked out in that fight. And the guy that I predicted, Benavidez, went on to knock out Demetrius Andrade within the rounds of 6 to 9 rounds. But my overall assessment of this fight, it was good performance by Benavidez. Showed why he's currently the second best super middleweight in the sport of boxing today. He's the second best fighter in this respective division at 168 pounds. He proved that again last Saturday in the fight with Demetrius Andrade. And he's put together he had a pretty good performance in that fight. And he's put together a pretty good year in terms of being fighting elite fighters and picking up solid wins. That's what Benavidez did this year, defeating Caleb Plant earlier in 2023, and then last Saturday defeated Demetrius Andrade, arguably the two best fighters outside himself and Canelo Alvarez in the super middleweight division. Benavidez went on to defeat both of them in the calendar year 2023. So to me, that's impressive, and that's showing me that Benavidez is ready for the big time fights. He's ready for the big time, potentially be the next big time pay-per-view star in the sport of boxing. Will that happen? Time will tell. But he's off to a great start in proving that to the boxing world, critics, and his fan base around the world. One thing that I saw during this fight, I saw that in the game plan I had for Demetrius Andrade, I've said if he wanted to win that fight Saturday, he would have to start off fast, which he did. And he's always been a fast starter in his boxing career thus far, which he started off fast and landed some good combination of Benavidez in the beginning part of that fight. But there's one thing I do question. Why was the game plan for Demetrius Andrade? He had to weigh in at least at 168 pounds for the weigh-ins. Why would you blow him up an additional 28 pounds the next night for that fight? You had Demetrius Andrade, from reports, was blown up, and when he got into that boxing ring, weighed in at a total of 190 pounds, maybe even heavier. But why would you blow up Demetrius Andrade, someone who is pretty skillful in that boxing ring, someone that likes to move around that boxing ring? I think that additional 28 pounds added and a total of 24 hours was very unnecessary. I thought that really made him a little bit, just a tad bit slower in that boxing ring. I just don't think that was a good strategy for him and his team. for that fight. But nonetheless, Benavidez defeats Demetrius Andrade by technical knockout to retain the interim WBC super middleweight title. Which brings me to my next question. What is next for Benavidez? I think we all know what should be next for Benavidez. And that's a showdown with Canelo Alvarez in an undisputed super middleweight championship fight in the calendar year of 2024. This has to be the next fight that takes place in the sport. Big mega fight, in terms of big mega fights that take place next in the sport of boxing. And I think Canelo Alvarez versus Benavidez would be an absolute banger to have on Cinco de Mayo weekend in 2024. And Benavidez is more deserving of this shot against Canelo Alvarez. He beat Caleb Plant earlier in this year. He defeated Demetrius Andrade last Saturday night. Those are the two best super middleweights in the division outside of Canelo Alvarez and Benavidez. And he's been the mandatory for Canelo Alvarez for quite some time now, being the interim WBC super middleweight champion. I think this fight between Canelo Alvarez and Benavidez is something that the whole boxing world wants to see, between two Mexican athletes, to determine who is the best Mexican fighter in the sport of boxing today. And I think that fight between Canelo Alvarez and Benavidez could easily do a million pay-per-view buys or more on Cinco de Mayo weekend in the calendar year 2024. Let's get this fight next in the sport of boxing. There's nothing holding it back at this point. But what's next for Demetrius Andrade? Now, Demetrius Andrade, it's not the end of the world he lost this fight. When you look at his record, he is still 32-1 in his boxing career. And there could still be some opportunities, some big-time opportunities for him still in his boxing career, even though he suffered his first career loss at the hands of Benavidez last Saturday. But I'm finally glad, something I will say, I am finally glad that Demetrius Andrade, unfortunately, it happened this late in his boxing career. He's 35 years of age, and he should have been presented way more opportunities earlier on in his boxing career. Unfortunately, the promoters he used to work with, Eddie Hearns and company, didn't see it that way. And I'm glad he finally got his big-time moment in the sport of boxing. Over the years, he's stated that he wanted to fight the likes of Canelo Alvarez, Triple G, and Jermall Charlo. None of those fighters ever gave him an opportunity the way how Benavidez gave him an opportunity. And they all, in my respective opinion, they all ducked him. Demetrius Andrade was there for a very long time. One of those fighters could have fought him over the years in the sport of boxing. Point blank, period. But it just so happened Saturday night he stepped in the ring with, in my opinion, the second best super middleweight fighter in the world today, in Benavidez, and it just wasn't his night. But I am worried about Demetrius Andrade moving forward, because I'm worried that the sport of boxing will now view him as a gatekeeper. Like I just touched up on, he's already 35 years old. When you don't have a top win in your resume, being a two-division world champion, that is alarming. And I feel like the sport of boxing and young talented fighters are going to try to use Demetrius Andrade as a stepping stone. And I do believe he could be a potential gatekeeper, which would not get him any more big-time opportunities in the sport of boxing. But those are my thoughts on Benavidez versus Demetrius Andrade. And yes, we should be getting Canelo Alvarez versus Benavidez next in the sport of boxing. It only makes sense.